Brittany Davis with Lucid for Education. And we also have Dr. Suzy Cox, who will introduce herself.
I'm waving with the wrong hand. Hello. So hi, I'm Dr. Cox. I'm an associate professor at Utah Valley University, and I specialize in secondary education, in particular educational technology and computer science education. So I also run what we call the Creative Learning Studio, which is kind of a test lab for how we can integrate computer science and robotics across the K-12 curriculum. So we'll be talking about some ideas that we've got for getting started with computer science.
So let's just jump straight into that then. We are so grateful to learn from Dr. Cox. So I will pull up here our notes about that. One quick little housekeeping item is that Dr. Cox has been kind enough to share this information with us after the webinar, so we'll send that out with the links and the recording as well in case you'd like to forward it on to others. So here we go, just to dig into the agenda a little bit today. We'll be focusing in on what exactly is computer science. I think you're helping us with that. And then what's required. And then like a large question we hear all the time is, so where do we actually start with this? And some concrete examples. So I'll just turn this over to you.
So a lot of what we'll be talking about today, while it looks Utah specific, is actually stemming largely from national efforts. So if you head over to csteachers.org or you look up the Computer Science Teachers Association, they came up with the computer science framework and the standards for computer science years ago. We've recently adopted those, or kind of adapted those, I should say, here in Utah. And so I'm going to kind of go over what's happening in Utah, and I think you'll find that it echoes in many of your contexts as well. But part of where we're trying to start is just by defining computer science, because that's part of the battle that we as educators have to face is what exactly are we talking about here? And unfortunately, most of the definitions you find are quite broad. So this is the one that Utah has adopted. It's the study of computers and algorithmic processes, including their principles, their hardware and software designs, their implementation, and their impact on society. So when you look at that, you're like, okay, so it's everything with computers. And then there's some words thrown in there that we don't really understand either. So that's pretty great. So luckily, the CS Teachers Association has helped to clarify some of those terms for us. So first, we kind of have to think about what computer science is versus some of these other concepts that we talk a lot about in education. So we're trying to tease out what is the use of computers and computing applications, and then what's actually computer science. And really the conclusion is that computer science builds on other fields. It builds on computer literacy, educational technology, digital citizenship, information technology, and probably a few other things. So getting into each of those, and again, this is all coming out of the Computer Science Teachers Association, so feel free to jump on there and take a look at their materials too. But when we talk about computer literacy, that's kind of our basic, do you know how to get onto the internet? Do you know how to use some of Lucid's awesome products? Do you know how to, kind of turn it on and off when you need to? Could you make a PowerPoint presentation, etc., right? So it's just this basic fluency of being able to use computers. And then as we think about that in a specific educational context, we get more into the realm of educational technology. So can we use these technologies to learn and demonstrate learning within a classroom environment or online? Digital citizenship, of course, then gets into kind of the appropriate and responsible use of that technology, as well as kind of internet safety kinds of things. And then information technology is a little bit more about the hardware and networking and things like that. Here in Utah and in many locations, there is some overlap between information technology and computer science. Many of the curricula are actually woven together. So we'll have elements of information technology inside of a computer science class. And as we look at the national standards, we'll actually see that there are standards about computing systems, so the information technology side of it, within these computer science standards. So that's kind of how nationally we're defining these four terms. And then we realize, getting on the right screen, there we go, that computer science then builds off of all of those. So those are kind of foundational things that then help us prepare for and kind of interact with computer science. So I really like the way that the Computer Science Teachers Association fleshed it out in this paragraph, right? So those other disciplines, especially digital literacy and digital citizenship and those kinds of things, they really focus on how we use computer technologies, whereas computer science is really understanding why they work that way and how to create them. So not how to create with those technologies, but how to actually make those technologies. So it's really getting into those fundamental skills of how programs work and how we can make our own programs. That last statement on this slide to some people might be a little controversial. The framework envisions a future in which being computer literate means knowing computer science. But we're seeing evidence of that throughout Utah and really throughout the globe, as we see that our farmers here in Utah actually can't repair many of their own tractors because of the computing systems that are on board these tractors. So without that computer science understanding of how those programs work and how they can make adjustments and adaptations to those programs, they're not able to effectively do their jobs. So we're seeing it really in every single context. So we're kind of saying, in the future, if our kids are going to be able to be successful in any field, literally any field, they're going to have not just digital literacy, but computer science knowledge. No, this big statement. All right, so I get this a lot. I have heard it and maybe at one point might have argued it myself. But one point we're trying to make, especially in elementary schools, is that keyboarding doesn't count. So keyboarding is not computer science. It's simply a method of inputting information into the computer. So as we start looking at a future world in which we're kind of all required to teach computer science at all levels of education, we need to start thinking about which of our classes and offerings and activities actually count as computer science. And keyboarding is not one of them. All right. So we have a couple of other definitions that I think you'll probably see as you're kind of diving into computer science. The main one I thought you might like to hear about is computational thinking. And this is a very broad definition as well, just thinking of it as a way of solving problems, designing systems, and understanding human behavior that draws on concepts fundamental to computer science. So the way that computational thinking is different from problem solving or design thinking or something like that is that it specifically tries to figure out how computing and automation could help us solve these problems. So as we kind of take these problems apart or decompose them, right? We decompose the problem and we figure out what the unnecessary details are. Then we think about, could I use computing to help me solve this problem? And what would that look like? And that's when we get into computational thinking. And then as we look at computing education, that's kind of where we're all trying to get. So how are we going to include scripting, coding, web development, computer programming into our curricula across grade levels and across subject areas? All right. So what that's meaning for us here in Utah, and I think in many of your contexts as well, is that there's a legislative push at this point for us to ensure that every student in our school system has access to rigorous and engaging computer science curriculum. The way we're currently defining that, and it's looking similar to what many other states across the nation have done, is to say that we're going to offer courses, specific computer science courses at the middle school and high school levels. But then really the brunt of this is actually falling on our elementary teachers, as always. So our poor lovely elementary teachers are going to have to figure out how to get kids both computational thinking and digital literacy in addition to all of their curriculum. So let's teach them how to read and write and do math and understand science and understand how to use educational technologies and understand how to do computing, all of it. So you can see that last sentence just makes me kind of smile, but this begins in our elementary schools with competencies in keyboarding. They're not off the hook for keyboarding. The appropriate and responsible use of technology. So that implies that literacy and citizenship component, and basic coding principles. So they at least need to have some understanding of how computer science works at a basic level in elementary school. Okay. So where is this all stemming from, right? And I can kind of tell you a little bit of the story of computer science in Utah. It is a booming business here in Utah. We have our Silicon Slopes location, which is, you know, multi-billion-dollar businesses that are really centered around computing. We have about 4,000 to 5,000 open computing jobs this year, and we had about 1,300 graduates in computer science last year. So we are definitely not filling the need as far as, you know, the economy goes. But we're more concerned about who is filling those jobs. So of those about 1,300 graduates last year in computer science, only 13% of them were women. So that's completely unacceptable. It's actually much lower than even national averages, which tend to be 18 to 22%. So ours is really, really low. We also have very disappointing numbers of participation of students of color. So if we look at our AP statistics, we only had one Native American and one Pacific Islander in the entire state take an AP computer science test last year. And if you know anything about Utah demographics, that's ridiculous because we have quite high populations of Pacific Islanders and Native Americans. About 10% of the students who took AP computer science last year were Latino, Hispanic. Also not acceptable. Our population is closer to 20 to 25%. So we're really not including underrepresented groups in our computer science education. So here's kind of the phenomenon we have, and I know this is similar across the nation. We get kids who might be lucky enough to get that one teacher in second grade who went to a conference and learned about computer science and brought it back to his classroom or her classroom and said, guess what, kids, we're gonna learn computer science this year, and we're gonna learn about loops and conditionals and all this great stuff, right? So this little class of 20 to 30 kids gets that experience. And then a couple of years go by and they don't have a teacher that's into that, and they get to 5th grade and they get that teacher, and that teacher comes into the classroom and says, guess what, guys, we're gonna do computer science this year. We're gonna do loops and conditionals. And it's the same stuff they learned about in 2nd grade. And it happens again in 7th grade. You know, it's like this perpetuation because there's no consistency in what we're doing across grade levels. And some of the kids have gotten it and some of the kids haven't, that the teachers feel like they have to start at the beginning every single time. So that's part of what we're fighting, is making sure that there's some consistency so that kids aren't getting that same instruction over and over again. And then prepare yourselves, because the next slide reveals how old I am. Okay. All right. So what if you never happen to get that teacher that's super excited? I mean, there are literally kids who go through their entire schooling career and never do any computer science at all. And the result of that can be pretty terrifying. I was at a career and technical education night at a high school the other day, and had proudly taped on our door. I co-teach a high school computer science class in my spare time. And we had taped on the door a sign that said computer science in a robotic format and all that kind of stuff. And my neighbor girl, who happens to be Hispanic, walks up to the door, sees the sign and says, computer science, ew, no, and walks away. So this exact demographic that we're hoping to serve has already self-selected out because they never had enjoyable and enriching experiences in elementary school. All right, so our timeline and how this has all started to roll out may be very similar to all of yours. Some colleagues of mine conducted a landscape report. That's a really great place to start, right? What is already happening in your context with regard to computer science? And you'll find that there's a teacher here and a teacher there, or a school here and a school there that's doing a really good job already. So that's kind of what took place statewide for us in 2017. And in that same year, the legislature passed a fairly modest computing partnership grants program to just kind of test the waters and see what we could get started across the state. And that was administered by our state STEM Action Center. Last year, or I guess this is 2 years ago now, a year and a half ago, we really started to coalesce a community across the state around computer science education. So I helped found the CS for Utah Coalition, which is, it's not got any kind of legislative mandate. It's just representatives from each of the big organizations that are involved in computer science across the state. And we get together once a month online, so we don't have to travel because our state is big, and we talk about what's going on. So what's happening in the legislature, what's happening at the State Board of Education, what do we know about as far as professional development opportunities. We just kind of get all this information together so we all know what's happening and are able to share that out with our different audiences. So we've got the state board represented, we have the Governor's Office of Economic Development represented, higher education, K-12 education, our CTE teachers and computer science teachers. So really representation from across the board of people who are interested in computer science. That has been a powerful kind of motion that's taking place to get things moving and to get more communication collaboration going. We had our framework approved in October of 2018. It's pretty much just the Computer Science Teachers Association framework that Utah said, yeah, we like that, we'll adopt that for here too. So if you haven't seen that framework, definitely take a look. And then they started working on our state master plan and finally finished that this past spring. So in 2019, we got that state master plan that kind of outlines where we want to go with computer science across the state. We just, in spring 2019, also had a larger Computer Science Grant Act authorized, and that provided funding for all of the school districts across the state to come up with a 4-year strategic plan. How are we going to roll out computer science education in each of our districts? We had our K-5 standards approved, and what that means is there are now standards in place for every grade level, K-5, for every student. So these are not kids that participate in after school activities or go to a specialty that's unique that they can elect into or anything like that. They are standards that every student in the state of Utah are supposed to meet at each grade level. Again, these were kind of adapted from the National Computer Science Teacher Association standards. So these have already been written and your state can adopt them for use within your context. So we adjusted a few things for our contexts. And we likewise have done that with the 6th through 12th grade standards. Again, these are standards for every student in the school system. So whether they decide to take computer science electives or not, every student in our school system will be expected to meet these 6th through 12th grade standards. They are currently in draft form, open to public comment, and they'll be finalized later this year. So at this point, our governor has made a massive request to actually fund the implementation of our state strategic plans or our district strategic plans. So we'll see what happens with that in a couple of months when the legislature is finished with their duties. And meanwhile, our districts are madly writing their strategic plans. So I thought it might be beneficial for everybody to see what our state is asking for within those strategic plans, because it is really a nice kind of way of thinking about what all would need to go into one of those and all the things you need to think about as you start to plan for CS in your context. All right, so in our state master plan, they focused on 6 dimensions, and these then translated into what they're asking for in the district strategic plans. So there has to be some data and reporting, and we were a little worried about this one at first. If anybody has looked at how do we measure the impact of computer science education, there's not a lot of research out there. To my knowledge, there's only one instrument that's been fairly thoroughly vetted as far as providing some valid data about kids' computational thinking. We've got some computing attitudes and things like that, but as far as outcomes, there's not a lot out there at the moment. So really our state is going to focus right now on implementation data. Who's participating, what's being offered, are we increasing the participation of certain demographics of students, et cetera. The rest of it is really where we are going to focus our efforts. So teacher development, I'm sure you in your context have a similar problem to us, which is we don't have on hand a bunch of CS teachers knocking down the door trying to get into education. So what we're doing a lot of is taking existing teachers and saying, hey, let's train you and get you some development in how to teach computer science. So that's a big focus. Choosing, designing curriculum that aligns to the standards. Utah is no control, no curriculum state, right? So it's a local control state. So every district can decide what curricula they want to use as long as they meet the state standards. Increasing diversity of the student population, outreach and communication. So that's a big one, making sure that parents know what we're doing and are on board, and that local businesses who may have an interest in computer science would have opportunities to be involved. And then of course, how are we going to fund this going forward? So once, big government dollars run out, how are we going to sustain this? So that's kind of what's in the state master plan. We've got links in here for those of you who want to see what Utah has going on as far as the framework, the standards, and then the courses and pathways that we offer for computer science. So I'll just leave you to play with those later. So what our districts are having to do is to write a 4-year implementation plan, and it really is a 4-year implementation. So I'm very proud of that they're not saying, all right, next year, starting fall 2020, you have to have everything in place. It's really, first year, let's do some teacher professional development. Second year, let's do some piloting to see what systems look like, really, so every district can figure out how to get there on their own terms. So ultimately what they're going to have to offer, and this is within the next 4 years, and I'm sure the requirements will boost over time, but for now it's 1 computer science course in every middle school in the state, 1 computer science course in every high school in the state, and then integration of computer science with these K-5 standards in every elementary school in the state. They really want all of that in place in some form by 2022, so that's 2 years from now, but a realization that we're going to have to grow into it. The emphasis is going to be on that professional learning, so making sure that there's a plan in place for teachers to get that professional learning taken care of, and that it's ongoing, because you can't train teachers once in computer science, unfortunately. It's just like our ed tech that we need ongoing training in these fields. And then it really needs to be articulated. So the districts will have to show how kids will go from kindergarten to 1st to 2nd, all the way up to 12th with these articulated opportunities. So they're not doing all that repeat and filling in of holes over time. And then really, how are we going to communicate this out to parents in the community and local business partners, and how are we going to gather the data? So you can see that those plan requirements mimic almost perfectly what was listed out in that state strategic or state master plan. There are also a few other important considerations that I'd urge you to think about. One of them is, how are you going to internally market what you're doing with computer science to counselors, for example, so that high school and middle school counselors know what's going on and why it's happening. We actually had, don't tell anybody, okay, but we had a counselor at our high school where I'm teaching computer science, or where I was a couple of years ago, tell a girl that wanted to take my class not to take it because it would be full of nerdy boys. So this is, it was horrible. But this is a case of just, some existing misconceptions that a counselor might have with fully good intentions, right? But communicating to one of our underrepresented populations that she wasn't welcome in computer science. So we're gonna have to market and train and assist and do those kinds of things, as well as building administrators and the community. So why are we requiring kids to take computer science, and how would a principal and a vice principal kind of set a vision for the building about what that's going to look like and why they're doing it? So we're also encouraged to have a district-wide community event each year to bring the community to the school and do some computing, and then the usual stuff when you have to get a grant, right? So there's reporting and a sustainability plan. And then the last piece, I love that they put this in there, is a plan for regional collaboration. So instead of doing this all on your own, who are your regional partners going to be to help you get this done? And so there are a lot of opportunities for that. All right, so those are the requirements. Where do we actually start with all of this? First of all, I wanted to make sure everybody's aware that the National CS for All organization offers something called a script workshop. So a script workshop, you sit down with a series of 5 rubrics. And those rubrics are centered around what we just have been talking about. Where are you with regard to having your leadership involved in computer science planning? Where are you with regard to teacher professional learning? Where are you with regard to curriculum and materials selection? So you go through this really intense but very powerful process of identifying where you currently are with computer science and setting goals for where you need to go. I have been working with districts on this for the last several months, and it's been very, very beneficial for them to have a structured way of looking at their computer science implementation instead of just looking at the standards and getting scared because there are a lot of standards in there and it can be overwhelming. So the script workshop I found hugely beneficial. Here in Utah, you contact the STEM Action Center to schedule one of those, but you can also reach out directly to that National CS for All organization and they can connect you with somebody local to help you with it. But let's really get into thinking about how we get started. So first and foremost, 100% professional development for our teachers. So find every possible experience to get teachers professional learning. As we go down this road of where we get started, there's a lot of great stuff that teachers who own their content and own their classes can do as they look at these standards and start to tease them out. But until they understand what some of the terms are and what we mean by computer science, that could be a challenging and overwhelming experience for them. So I personally would advocate, first and foremost, let's get those teachers off to a conference or bring in some experts to do some model lessons with them so they know what we mean when we say, okay, we're going to integrate computer science. I've brought up a couple of upcoming opportunities. Some of those are local to Utah and others are available nationally. So USET, for example, is a national conference that's happening actually next week that has a bunch of computer science elements. That's our local educational technology conference. So many of you would have an equivalent nearby that you could go to, and I would be willing to bet they're going to have strands on computer science. Similarly, we have like the Utah Association of Career and Technical Educators, that Utah ACTE. That's another venue that our teachers can go to get some training. Some of these others are more national. So code.org has partners throughout the nation, and I'm not saying you have to use code.org curriculum. You can choose whatever curriculum you want, but they have some good starter training. The CS fundamentals trainings are for elementary school teachers. CS discoveries is for middle school, and CS principles is for high school. So it just kind of introduces methods for teaching computer science, whether or not you use code.org's curriculum, as well as what these concepts mean. So as we're talking about helping children develop algorithms and using conditionals and having them abstract out details, these trainings would get you those ideas. So what you do to find those is just go on to code.org. I think I did not put a link in here, but I can certainly send it along to Brittany. But you go to their professional development page, put in your zip code, and it will tell you what workshops are being offered near you in the next several months. So that's a great resource. And then 2 big national conferences that you can always reliably find good information for computer science. We've got ISTE, which is the International Society for Technology and Education. Many of you probably already know about that, being technology directors and things like that in your state or in your context. So ISTE has a lot going on with computer science this year, thanks to the addition of the computational thinking standard in the ISTE standards, as well as the computational thinking competencies for educators that they just released a few months ago. So there's a lot at ISTE this year that'll be about computer science. And then the Computer Science Teachers Association Conference is out in Arlington, Virginia, and I know we have some Virginians on board today. So that is an outstanding conference, and there's a misconception around that one that it's only for high school teachers. It is a K-12 conference. I go and steal everybody else's ideas and sell them as my own. No, just kidding. But they really are fantastic. And you get people like Arkansas and San Francisco who've actually been doing computer science in all of their grade levels for 5 years. They're telling you how they've done it. So really starting there is a great idea. All right. So once we get a little familiarity with what we mean by computer science and what that might look like, we've got to dive into those standards and figure out what they actually say. I wholeheartedly embrace the fire hose version of this now. So really pulling together a group of teachers, having them work in grade bands. So I like to put my K1-2s together and my 3 through 5s together, and then maybe have a little bit of overlap and discussion so that they can see, all right, I'm a first grade teacher. What's kindergarten supposed to do? What's second grade supposed to do? How do I fit in within all of this? And what's amazing is I find that teachers, and actually I was sitting down with an assistant superintendent of elementary education for a district the other day. So she was in charge of all the elementary schools in the district. And she was one of the biggest kind of detractors from computer science at first. She's like, I'm not going to give my teachers one more thing. And then we sat down with the standards and we looked at what they were actually asking teachers to do. And she was like, oh, they're already doing most of that. For a lot of things, it's really just a vocabulary change, maybe a little bit of a culture change within your school. But she really came away with the idea that if we get teachers the training that they need, they're already doing a lot of it. And as they look at these standards, they're going to be able to figure out where they're already doing things, which vocabulary they need to change, and then where they need to add a few other elements. But she was really surprised by that, and actually by the end of the workshop was completely on board with her teachers being able to do this. So one idea that we've had too along with this is to take those key vocabulary terms from the standards and make a word wall that's child friendly. So having that as part of your classroom decor or even your school building decor is to have a CS word wall with words like these on the screen that can be a little scary at first, and child friendly definitions for those. So we had fun writing the standards that some of the teachers wanted to change the word decompose, which you're not allowed to do because it's a computer science word, but they were like, but it's icky. We're like, I know, but we had to keep it. All right. So after we figure out what we're already doing, I find it hugely beneficial to start to do a standards crosswalk. And what I mean by that is, could we start looking at the standards and really seeing where the overlaps are and identifying those specifically? So I came up with a couple of examples for you. Looking at the kindergarten standards, when we look at math, we see these first two standards, and these of course are our state standards, but they're closely modeled after the Common Core standards for mathematics. So they're supposed to, in math, these are the computer science standards at the top there. So they're supposed to identify and describe patterns in data visualizations and model processes by creating and following algorithms. When we look down at the math standards, which are the bottom two there, within measurement and data, look at that. Describe and compare measurable attributes of objects and classify objects and count the number. So they're supposed to be identifying and describing patterns and doing data visualization. So those two standards are really the same thing. And then similarly, model processes by creating and following algorithms to complete tasks. They're supposed to, at that bottom standard, represent addition and subtraction by using a bunch of different algorithms. So could we count on our fingers? Could we use objects? What algorithm could we follow to complete addition and subtraction tasks? So they really, you can find these alignments quite quickly once you have a little bit of training in what the standards mean. Okay. So math is a logical example. We might not always think of a connection to language arts unless you're Brittany, because she was an English teacher and I was a Spanish and dance teacher, so I'm all over the place. All right, but as we look at this, okay, in the computer science standards, kids are supposed to create programs with sequences of commands and simple loops to express ideas or address a problem. So the whole point of writing a program for a first grader is to express ideas or address a problem. And as we look at writing standard 2, they're supposed to, for example, write informative or explanatory text to examine a topic and convey ideas and information clearly. So we could pull these two together using something like Scratch Junior, where the kids could come up with a little storyboard or an explanation of a concept using that program with commands and loops. Or they could do it without a computer. So another way to do this is to simply within their informational or explanatory text that they're writing, include something that loops or include a sequence of steps or commands. So not all of these standards have to be met on a device. That's another key piece of all of this. All right, moving up into second grade. I promise I'm not going to do every grade, although I would love to. As we're looking at science. So again, in our second grade computer science standards, they're supposed to collect and present data in various visual formats and identify and describe patterns in that data. So very similar to the standards we saw in kindergarten. But now look what's in the science core for second grade. They're supposed to decide what data to collect and how to organize, record, and manipulate it, and then analyze that data, make conclusions connected to it, identify limitations, etc. So again, they're almost identical standards, but now we're doing this as part of the scientific process where they're designing an experiment, they're gathering data, and then they have to represent and interpret that data. So they're literally the same standards. All right, and then social studies, another field where you might think there's not a ton of overlap. But what I love about the CSTA, those national standards, is that they've included a whole strand within the standards on the impact of computing. So specifically here in the computer science standards, they're supposed to evaluate how computing technologies have changed the world. And then as we look at the social studies standards for us, for third grade, explain changes within communities caused by human inventions. Again, almost the same standard. Obviously, computing would just be a subset of all of the human inventions, but really leading third graders in an interesting investigation and discussion about how the use of computers has changed the world. Can you imagine what it would result if every 8th grader in the world took the time to think about that? We would have slightly different computing and social structures, I think. So I'm actually very excited about this particular crosswalk. All right, and then I think this is like next step. So I'm kind of trying to go in order, right? We're gonna get our teachers' professional development first. Then we're gonna ask them to engage with the standards and see what they're already doing. Then we can have them do some crosswalk and see where there are parallel concepts. And then they'll be ready to do some of this creative integration. This is my personal favorite thing to do. I love coming up with these cross-curricular integrations that allow computer science to just help us tell the story of what we're learning in other disciplines. So these are where it doesn't have computer science as a separate subject, but really we're using it as a tool for creation. So this is one of my absolute favorite lessons. I'm actually engaging my pre-service teachers in this lesson right now as an example of what they could do in their classrooms. But we introduced the social studies concept from 6th grade about how ancient civilizations' religions became a big part of kind of our modern world. And so we do a little augmented reality and do a little walk in the stars with the Star Walk app. And we start to notice that all of the constellations that we see on this app are named after Greek gods and legends and things like that. So we can see that indelible impact of the Greek culture and religion still today. And then what we do is there are a couple different versions of this lesson, but one of them they do some research into the constellations of other cultures. So this is a big mind blower for even my adult students, that other cultures have different constellations than we do, that there are different ones in Chinese culture, there are different ones in Navajo culture. I love to show my students because we have a high Navajo population here. And so they do some research into one of those constellations and create a representation of it using a robot. And part of what we can do with that is actually have them chart out that constellation on a coordinate plane. So now we're overlapping with our math curriculum as well. In 6th grade, they're supposed to be able to graph points on a coordinate plane and label those vertices appropriately. And so they could actually plot their stars on this coordinate plane on graph paper. And then we program our Sphero robot, which I've got a picture of there, to actually navigate that constellation and light up at each of the stars as they kind of retell the story of the constellation. So that is a fun activity that actually integrates social studies, language arts as they're doing writing and speaking standards, math as they're doing the coordinate plane. We have an extension on that activity where they use the science concept of scale, and we talk about, okay, is that how far apart the stars really are? And are they all in the same plane, or are they really, you know, spread far apart in all dimensions? So we have that conversation as well. Computer science standards and ISTE standards are educational technology standards. So standards from 5 different disciplines in one lesson. And I love it. 6, just kidding, I can count. All right. I'll give you a couple more examples and then I'll show you a link to some of these that you can use. But this is another one we did with some 3rd graders down on the Navajo Nation actually a few months ago. It was super fun. But as the 3rd graders are learning about animal life cycles, we did some reading. So we actually read The Very Hungry Caterpillar, which is the best book of all time, and talked about animal life cycles. And then students had to come up with the life cycle steps of their favorite animal, and they marked that out. So for many of our Navajo students, those were horses, which was beautiful. And then they used Ozobots and just did the line following aspect of an Ozobot to code the life cycle of this animal. And so the Ozobot would travel from step to step and perform an action using a color-based code, as you can see on the screen there, that would kind of represent that stage of the life cycle. So for example, the caterpillar coming out or the butterfly coming out of its chrysalis, they might have the Ozobot kind of spin around in a circle as it's wrestling to get out of its chrysalis, and they have to kind of justify that. So. And then this is one that we did with 4th graders here in Park City, Utah. They were learning about animal adaptations in science. And they'd recently conducted some observations of dogs to see how dogs were different from wolves because they were reading informational text about wolves and their adaptations. And then we took this into a little bit of a creative vein, and we read some of Rudyard Kipling's Just So stories, which are stories that talk about animal adaptations and the real scientific reasons why they happen, but do it in a creative writing kind of way. And so our students did that. They came up with their own story of a wolf adaptation, why it had happened. And then we programmed those in Scratch. So they created an animated presentation in Scratch. So they were having to choose media and do programming and all of this kind of stuff to actually make that happen. So as you can see, these integrated projects are really where the beautiful stuff happens as kids are able to see how computer science can be used to help them kind of express their knowledge and create things and contribute to ideas. All right, so I have in the slides here a link to a folder. It's not a super organized folder at the moment because this is like, we've been starting work on this and doing it really intensely for the last little bit, but we've created a bunch of these model lessons that are these integrated creative approaches to computer science. So you're welcome to all dive into that folder, steal what you will from that, even just to show your teachers as examples of what might be possible in their classrooms. Those are open to you to use. It's all good. And just kind of coming back to where do you find a network? So one of our requirements for our strategic plans is to find a regional network that they can rely on and kind of find support and collaborate with. We have one that we've built on our state kind of educational resource website, which is the Utah Education Network. So we've built a hub there that has discussion groups that teachers can join, and it has links to free curricula. And it's got code.org, it's got CS in San Francisco's curriculum, it's got all kinds of different people's free curricula that they've just offered up. We aggregated it all in one place so teachers would be able to find that. And then we're currently working on a piece of this where they would be able to find the professional development opportunities as well. So here in Utah, we've created an online network for that. Computer Science Teachers Association also has regional chapters. So you would want to leverage those as well. If you don't know your regional chapter yet, you can just do a quick search for CSTA chapter and then wherever you are, and you should be able to find that chapter and get involved with them. And if you don't have a strong local chapter, then get involved with them nationally. So I think their website is csteachers.org. You can hop on there and find all kinds of teachers doing similar work The other resource that you might reach out to, as I mentioned earlier with the script workshop, is CS for All. So CS for All has a member directory, and that's both companies and school districts and other people who are doing the work of computer science, and just contacting people and asking what they are doing. As I think that's the most powerful thing we can do, as those of us who are kind of newer to computer science education are coming in and trying to figure out how to get this done. We can rely on the people that have been doing it for a while. So we're lucky to have people like Arkansas and San Francisco, and here in Utah we have Park City School District, who's actually been implementing computer science education in their curriculum for several years, and so relying on their wisdom to get everybody else started. Okay, I have ended this with my contact information. Please feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to answer questions and provide additional resources and links that weren't in this presentation. You also have the link there to my website, where we have the resources for our creative learning studio, including the kind of hardware that we offer. It's in the process of being updated, but you'll get the gist. So kind of going back through everything that we talked about. As you're getting started in computer science, first of all, check and see what's happening at your state level. Maybe do a landscape report of your school or your district or your state to see where you fit in with everything that's happening. Get some professional development for your teachers first and foremost. You might want to have a script workshop or something similar to help you start to set some concrete goals and have a structure that you're working within. And then it's all about just giving teachers the time and opportunity to learn the standards, do some crosswalking, and brainstorming some creative ideas, because they know their content and their kids, and will get us where we need to be.